We are ready for our first panel of the day. We had Bart Chilton, former regulator, big TV star, has a lot in common with the panel that I'm about to bring up on this stage. Our moderator for this panel, when she comes up here, there's going to be a gasp, but I know her. She is the founder of Forkast.news. That is a new venture that is bringing together this woman's deep expertise, her knowledge, her network, and her presence in the traditional world of finance and business. You know her from when she was a broadcaster and TV anchor on Bloomberg. She's a journalist at heart, and now she is an entrepreneur with her own media venture. She is going to come and command her panel. Ladies and gentlemen, please, big welcome for Angie Lau, coming up on stage from Forkast.news. Bring it. All right. Thank you, Angie.
Wow.
I'm going to help you out. Do you want me to bring up your panel, or are you going to bring it on?
Still my beating heart. Well, if you give me the reins, I'll take over.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Angie Lau in command. Let's hear it for her.
Thank you, everybody. It is my honor and great privilege to help lead this panel, Power Governance in Blockchain. I want you to think back 10 years ago. 10 years ago, blockchain did not even exist. And then we stared into the abyss called the global financial crisis. And from there was born Bitcoin. And from there was born a dream that perhaps things can be different. And now, 10 years later, we find ourselves here. 10 years later, we are at the cusp of what it can be, the potential of blockchain, of cryptocurrency. And so please help me welcome on the stage right now incumbents before and after in this space. I join to this space as a former incumbent in traditional media. I now join this space as a dreamer. Charles Mok is legislative counselor, co-founded HKNet, one of Hong Kong's earliest internet service providers, 25 years of experience, active in public service, and of course, a Hong Kong legislator, serving on various advisory bodies in Hong Kong government, hospital authority, WKCDA. Welcome, Charles Mok.
Thank you.
Joining us as well, Benedicte Nolens, head of regulatory affairs for Asia and Europe and CCO for Asia, Circle. She is also a former incumbent in this space, having served 6 years at Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. She now is at Circle, helping to provide that experience to guide to a greater vision. And finally, last but not least, please help me welcome Rocky Mu. He's a senior associate of Clifford Chance in Hong Kong with more than 10 years of legal experience with Clifford Chance. He brings to this space specialization in fund establishment, authorization of funds, licensing, and regulatory advice. So this is our panel, and we'll get to work. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
So we talk about power, we talk about governance, and we talk about blockchain. Let's talk about the promise of blockchain. Right now, there is so much passion, talent in this industry, but now we are seeing an insurgent of people like Benedicte, people like myself, who come from the incumbency space to try to really shape and mold blockchain to where it can be. Is this a good or bad thing, Benedicte?
Thank you. I would say it's a good thing, right? Because you need to guide, of course, the transition. I think myself, you're right, I come from the securities regulator. I was there 6 years. Of those 6, 3 were focused on risk and 3 became focused on fintech. So I became a member of fintech steering group. And over those 3 years, everything changed even by the day. So we actually published a report. It's still accessible online. But you will see it was very focused on crowdfunding and peer-to-peer lending. And about, let's say, 2.5 years into that process, Ether came around and then ICOs came around. And suddenly this became all a blockchain discussion. So I think you need people to help guide that path towards at some point regulation, the question is when, we can talk about that more. And to point out also where the lines of regulation already lie today, because there are many lines of regulation already in terms of, for example, AML, or in terms of, for example, there are actually criminal laws as well, right? Certain things like fraud are actually, they don't need new regulation. They have old regulation already. So now my life before that was actually with Goldman Sachs and Credit Suisse for 15 years. So I think it's that multifaceted approach that we need. I think Bart made a very good analogy with bamboo, because these scaffoldings, when I look at them, I'm always very surprised. I always think they can kind of fall apart, but they never do for the 20 years I'm in Hong Kong. So it's modular in terms of approach, and I think you need that fast and modular thinking.
The modular thinking, does that exist right now in Hong Kong? Charles?
Well, when I heard Bart's presentation, it reminds me quite a bit about what, I came from the last generation of .com 25 or almost 30 years ago. And I think we're seeing some parallels. The regulators, the government always were the last people to figure it out. And, but we have to live with that. It has to be regulated in the end. What we're seeing right now is that the regulators are, you talk about the excitement, the passion that in this crowd that you have. But to be honest, I don't see that passion and excitement yet from the regulators. I think what they are seeing is that they have a lot of fear. They worry about problems. They worry about their scaffolding falling apart, right? So they're worried. Because from their point of view, the biggest problem worried would be, what if consumer gets into trouble? What if these companies gone into bust and so on? What happened? And you don't have to remind them about some of the recent problems that they had in terms of regulatory issues.
Okay, fear is one thing, right? But how do you overcome fear?
Right.
You participate, engage in conversations with people internally in the space. Is the government doing that? Is the government engaging with people in the blockchain community?
I think they are doing that. I think they are doing that because, in a sense, in this particular space, I loved the other presentation earlier in the morning about decentralization. You have the competition from all over the world. So for a financial center like Hong Kong or even other cities, I think while the regulators are very worried, at the same time they are pushed that they cannot sit still and do nothing. So in a sense, you see in the first in the earlier phase, you would see a lot of resistance. Right now, I wouldn't say that they're totally embracing yet, but they had to figure something out. So all these sandboxes, to different extent, do they work? Do they not yet work? To different extent, but at least they're trying to figure out. They're trying to copy from one another. But of course, different markets do have different roles. For a market like Hong Kong or Singapore, maybe we're a little bit more mature. Maybe we're the regulators think that they need to be a little bit more careful than some of the up-and-coming markets.
Yes.
So the regulators, I think they're trying to learn, but it probably takes some time.
Well, you bring up a great point, because regulation shopping is something that we're seeing in the exchange space, right? So Rocky, let me bring you in, because you advise a lot of exchanges and funds, and as you put things together and thinking about the regulatory space, what do you advise projects and exchanges when it comes to regulation? Should they shop for the most flexible, or should they shop for leadership? That might be a little bit harder, but in the end, might have a better outcome. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's always a tricky question. All our clients come to us. How do we structure this? Where should we base ourselves? I mean, the trick about crypto is it's really a global operation. So you can't just say, I establish in Hong Kong and I only look at Hong Kong regulations. Inevitably, you'll have global operations. You'll have Singapore clients. You have US clients, Europe clients. So it's quite complex in terms of the analysis, and then brings in the tax issues, all the service providers, whether you have service providers locally to support your operations. So regulations is one of the key points, but you do need to have a global view. Now, the trick is how to have all the operators, issuers, service providers to ask and understand what's the right regulatory questions. A lot of times is you may think about it's just your own product, but you also need to think about what services are you doing, whether it's regulated in Hong Kong, if it's not, whether it's regulated elsewhere. So it's really that's kind of the dynamics we're seeing, but certainly in Asia, we're seeing Hong Kong and Singapore, and I would say Hong Kong's a better jurisdiction since I'm based here. It's the regulators are doing a lot to try to help the industry, and I do think this is the right direction to go, and we do have the right regulatory approach for this.
Not everybody agrees with you. Not everybody agrees with that perspective, and I'll bring it back to everybody in this space. Former SFC, Benedicte, you took a look at Ashley Alder's comments of the sandbox, and Charles, you're very familiar with that. Is this the kind of language that is welcoming, or did it actually spark some concern?
Well, I think actually the pronouncement was welcomed, and I think we need to distinguish between regulation and regulatory clarity. I think it's a very important distinction to make, because even when I look at the prior slides, it's mixing up regulatory clarity and new regulation. And I see a huge distinction in that. So to clarify what the definition of securities is about, Hong Kong has done it, Singapore, nearly every regulator has done it as early as the summer of 2017. It's just people weren't reading it until mid-2018. But so many regulators did. So to me, that's trying to clarify, but you have to keep in mind even the definition of securities is a very unclear one, and specifically on the definition of a collective investment scheme, which is exactly where in the US you fall in very broad range of the Howey test, and outside the US in other common law markets in luckily a slightly narrower interpretation of CIS. But it's by no means clear that interpretation, I would say. So I think, as I said, the statement was welcome because it provided regulatory clarity. At least it said this is our position today. Secondly, it also provided an option. If you want to come to the sandbox. Thirdly, a sandbox, I think, is actually a modular approach to that bamboo situation. Or, in fact, I was looking at this box sign here. It's very similar. It's modular. But where I think maybe the limitation of it is today is that this world of blockchain wants to create open finance. That's what it wants to do, okay? It wants to be a little bit like TripAdvisor. You know, let's say about 15 years ago or 20 years ago, when I arrived in Hong Kong, I used to go to everywhere. I still do, Laos, Cambodia, everywhere remote. And I used to pay a lot to travel agents. I used to pay $2,000 per person per trip. Now I don't do that anymore. I use a combination of TripAdvisor, Booking.com, AirAsia, Scoot, all the cheap stuff. And in fact, you know, I get my whole trip for a whole family for $2,000, okay? That's what this industry can do for finance. But it will not get there if it gets constantly told it needs to limit itself to only the richest of investors.
Yes.
So that's where a limitation currently, I think, lies. I think that the SFC is trying to strike that balance by making the sandbox optional, right? The other connection I would make, and I tried to make it earlier, is to crowdfunding. Certain markets have taken a proactive view about that and have come up and opened up finance through crowdfunding. Those markets are now, in my view, in a pole position on allowing the introduction of securities tokens. And you actually saw that in Dusan's earlier statement, because he said in the US you have Reg A up to $50 million you can actually place to the general public. It's very, very important. Currently, let's say we're lacking that in Hong Kong because there was never, let's say, a democratization of finance being introduced. So I think, as said, let's be very careful distinguishing between regulatory clarity, very useful, sandbox modular, very useful, and then regulation on the democratization of finance, very useful. It's happened in the US large scale with the Jobs Act. Most markets have followed and have created some allowance for that. And I don't think Hong Kong is there yet.
I also want to bring up the fact that Hong Kong, we must remember, is part of China. One country, two systems. The basic rule of law here is what distinguishes us to an international market. Charles, in a number of years, Hong Kong will be subsumed politically, government, law by China. That special administrative region, administrative, I guess, ring fence will no longer exist. How does this translate into future legal modularity for Hong Kong in blockchain?
Okay, subsumed into part of China. Politically, we're part of China, but I mean, many of us probably believe that it might not be such a good idea to be totally subsumed into China, and in the sense that I think when people are here, especially for the financial services world, people are here because of the differentiation that we have in Hong Kong in terms of rule of law and the free flow of money and all the other stuff. So I think it's important to take that distinction. But I think the integration to different extent in different ways with China is going to be still important because of obviously, you know, part of a big reason why Hong Kong is important as the financial services center is, after all, because of a lot of these capital that has to do with China. You know, actually, there was one point in the first keynote that I was very interested about, which was about the globalization and the decentralization. You have a map about all the cities in the world. But when I think about the internet, for example, increasingly, we're moving into a sort of like China, we used to be calling an intranet, a China internet and the rest of the world. Now, in terms of financial services, in terms of blockchain, what is going to happen with China? I don't know. I mean, that is a big question to all of you. As we move into this great globalization and, well, people don't like to use that word too much anymore, or decentralization, when you can deal with Europeans and Saudi Arabia, as in your example, what about China? The capital flow, that's a huge national issue for the rulers in China, that they are very concerned about this decentralization. What is going to happen? I don't have the answer, but I think it's very...
Is Hong Kong a testing ground? Is it being observed?
If China look at Hong Kong as a testing ground, I think in some ways they will, but if that's the case, I think this is to the benefit of Hong Kong. But of course, Hong Kong has to not only look into the Chinese accommodating into the Chinese system, but we have to maintain a very unique position so that we maintain our international position at the same time.
And intellectual honesty in this space.
Oh, sure, yes, yes.
And speaking of which, the intellectual honesty is very important as we talk about blockchain, because the fundamental philosophy of blockchain is decentralization, is bringing the economic power back to the individual. Now, right now, we're talking about regulation, we're talking about government, right? We're talking about all of these terms, KOL, right? We're talking about AML, and these are terms that, or KYC rather, not a KOL, KYC, AML, but these are terms that the incumbent systems are placing on blockchain right now and saying, here's the danger if we don't impose this KYC and AML regulatory compliance, et cetera, language into the space. Is there a philosophical divide here? And how do we work together? Does this work?
So I think it's important, again, to distinguish between a practical divide and a philosophical divide, okay? So I think for many of the blockchain players, they want to comply with the rules. So let's say ourselves, we are doing KYC for, I don't know how long, but let's say before I joined, that was all in place. So let's say a lot of the players, I think, are trying to comply with these things. But what I mean with a practical divide is what I think regulators still need to realize is that the technology can now enable other people as well right? So even if, let's say, there are good players around that will want to comply with the rules and do so voluntarily, there now is also the ability to create a decentralized world where none of that is happening. That already exists. Those are called the privacy coins. And, you know, it's not going to be easy to control that, even if regulations are created, and even if technically they'd be consistent globally, which is a near impossibility. I would say, for example, FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which controls the AML world, only has, I think, 58 members. How many countries are there on Earth? A lot more. So anyway, you will never get to full consistency, and therefore, as said, there's difference between philosophical divide and practical divide. That practical divide, we're getting there already, meaning that technology is global and it will be used. So the regulators need to shift as well into understanding more what tools you can use to trace money. And actually, I would say in the context of FATF and Interpol, they're doing a lot of effort in that regard. And actually, I think there are some people who are already extreme users of these tracing technologies that also are part of the blockchain ecosystem. But you see what I'm saying, right? I think it's wrong to assume that every blockchain player has a philosophical divide with regulation. That's not the case. But there are some, and they now have the technology to facilitate that. And that's unavoidable.
I'll bring my own experience to your point. When I was investigative consumer reporter back in the US before I joined Bloomberg, it really was a recognition that the system was made up of a number of actors, but the individual on their own is powerless. And sometimes when bad things happened, they reached out to me, somebody in the media who could advocate for them and who could advocate for their rights. In the same way, I feel like right now there's so many people in this space, good and unfortunately bad actors as well. And we saw that in 2017. I think that when we do start providing guidance and providing a set of laws and providing regulation, it actually makes the individual consumer feel more comfortable, more secure. This is why the basic rule of law is so important for Hong Kong. And it is interesting, and the whole world, it is interesting that you say perhaps Hong Kong could be the hands-off testing ground, that when we have achieved best practices here, possibly it could be applied elsewhere. Rocky, do you see the potential of being in Hong Kong in this space to have that kind of guidance and leadership in a global system?
Yeah, I mean, it's an example, classic example. What the SFC is trying to do with the sandbox now is to have a license granted to a cryptocurrency exchange. Now, this is under the sandbox. It may not happen. I hope it will happen. And my personal view, within the next 12 months, we're going to have the first licensed cryptocurrency exchange in Hong Kong. Now, and it will come with a lot of regulatory guidance as to what's the expected regulatory standards in terms of custody, insurance, cybersecurity, etc. Now, Hong Kong is, at least in the region, is one of the leading jurisdictions to provide guidance to the whole industry. And we are, in a way, setting the standards for global operations, for regulated operations of crypto exchange. And I see we are in a privileged position in Hong Kong with the regulators supporting this initiative. But I think one key is, again, the operators and the regulators needs to come together and really discuss and work it out together.
Do you see that happening right now?
It is happening right now. It's starting to happen. 2-3 years back, it's not. Both sides don't trust each other. The operators don't trust the regulators, saying they're not helpful.
Charles, how can you not trust Rocky? He's a very fine man.
From what I see, you know, I'm a little bit like Angie, except that people, when they're in trouble, other than coming to the media, they also come to us in the legislator and ask for our help. And first problem we had in Hong Kong is because we have 3 regulators for fintech. where if we compare ourselves with Singapore. So the perception is that policies are much more focused and unified in some other jurisdictions. But in Hong Kong, we have three. We have monetary authority for the banks, we have SFC for the securities, and we have insurance. So at first, blockchain was like none of the business for SFC, right? If you look back 4 or 5 years, it was just HKMA. And then, oh, HKMA is so happy now because nobody talked about that anymore, and they all moved to, okay, you go to SFC. So what I see with the sandbox is that I actually get a number of complaints or concerns from a number of players saying that it's moving too slow. And some even saying that, you know, they're not giving us the answers. They tell us to come back in Q4 of this year, not last year. So they were worried that, hey, what's going on? A sandbox supposedly should be a place where, you know, before you understand how to regulate, you try to figure out how to regulate. But it seems like some of the messages coming from the regulator is that we better figure out how to regulate before we let you play in the sandbox. So that's sort of like
interesting.
Putting the end in, you know, it's like
both sides distrusting each other in a way.
So I don't think it's necessarily a matter of trust, but it's still a matter of trying to figure out and control the end result. But I think even the regulators have to understand that sometimes, you know, you can't control everything in a sandbox. You have to give it some flexibility. And I think they're struggling with how much flexibility they can really provide.
Well, Benedicte is a perfect example and a beautiful example where she brings that experience from the SFC side internally at Circle. And it was very important at Circle to have somebody like Benedicte. And Angelina Kwan, now COO of BitMEX, is another example of incumbents moving into this space to really provide that guidance. Tell us from your point of view at Circle and formerly at SFC, how you view the next 10 years is going to be in blockchain.
Yeah, so I think this is a critical point, is where are we actually in the cycle of blockchain? And as part of my SFC days, one thing I had to do is look for research, right? And I tend to like the Gartner research a lot. And by the way, I get no commission from Gartner, okay? So, but please look up on your iPhones, you can do it now or later, the Gartner blockchain hype curve. And please look at it and look at all the text on it. And when you start looking at that, you will realize we're really in very early stage. And I think that's what most people have not understood. We now are so consumption-driven society that we think everything happens overnight. The internet did not happen overnight. You know, I was looking at the history of Amazon. It's over 20 years, as you know, founded in 1994. You know when the Kindle came around? And by the way, I find the Kindle the most outdated thing on earth, right? But it came around only in 2007. And the Kindle was not the end game. The end game is the books on the iPhone, but clearly even Amazon didn't know that. They spent so much time creating this Kindle, and so fast it was being superseded by the use on the iPhone. So I think the reality is, first of all, very early stage. A lot of it still needs to be built, and consequently, it is very hard to predict. And consequently as well, I'm not surprised that regulators are a little bit lost, because I think no one with certainty can predict the future right now or how this is going to play out. But of course, where people are trying to move is something called the programmable economy, where there is a lot more use of smart contracts, whether it is in finance or otherwise, and where decentralized technology, blockchain, is being used for authenticity, for trust creation, and for contract formation. And as said, that takes many building blocks, and they're not yet in place. So I would also say the difference in my experience, because I've come from traditional finance, then to the regulator, and now to the outer end, you could say I'm going like 180 degrees, right? So to be in a startup, and it's iterative process. It's not certainty, it's iterative. Every day you try, you learn, you try, you learn. And as someone also said, even for consumers, you try and learn what they like and what they don't like. I said, even with Amazon, that took them so long to get to a Kindle. And to get to their ultimate, now so controlling market capitalization, that only started about 5 years ago, to be frank with you.
Yes.
So let's look at technology in context. It doesn't happen overnight. For this sector, Bitcoin is 10 years old, but the investment in additional infrastructure for consensus mechanisms is only 2 years old. So it's too early to fully predict the future. It's too early to fully define frameworks. And I go back to the fact they need to be flexible, modular, but I also think they need to start considering that finance will be democratized, whether people like it or not. And what I mean with that, it's very hard to control. So for people who like to control, it's very difficult. But I think, as I said before, the practical reality is it can already be done. So, and it's going to evolve more from there, not less. Yeah.
I like to say that those who build today will guide tomorrow. So we had some future forecasting from Benedicte in her way. Charles, I want to give you the same opportunity. Blockchain is not even a teenager yet. Where will it go from the eyes of legislation and government?
Well, I think we talked already a lot about financial applications or securities and so on. But I really think that we could look at blockchain as a technology itself and be applied to many different areas. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation as well. And I think there the potential is going to be very high. The government everywhere in the world are beginning to use it in different kinds of contracts or land, or even in some cases tracking food and so on. These could be very useful, and these could be applications that well, we don't have to worry so much about the other concerns about money and financial issues and so on. And I think we should also not forget that blockchain, in terms of the technology, there's still huge potential in those areas as well.
Rocky.
Yeah. I think it's really the future is the development of the overall ecosystem. So we talk a lot about the issuers, operators, we talk a lot about regulators, but there are other service providers that needs to be in the game and be up to speed. So we have the custodians, we have the insurers, we have the auditors, all needs to be ready. And I think everybody has that interest, and everybody's moving towards that. And I think that will be the future with the whole ecosystem, a completely new ecosystem in the blockchain world that will be developed.
Well, it's a bet that everybody on this stage is making. It's a bet that all of you here at the conference is making. And on behalf of this panel, on behalf of Forkast.news, we do believe in the intellectual discourse, the intellectual honesty that we bring to this space. We might not always agree with each other, but it is, as Benedicte says, an iterative process. We must curate the best, because when we have best practices, we have the best technology, and it will underlie what we hope to be a better tomorrow. So thank you to our panel, and thank you to all of you.
Thank you very much to Rocky, Benedicte, Charles, and of course Angie Lau from Forkast.news. Ladies and gentlemen, let's make it big. Thank you. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, they will be going to get unmiked, and then they will be going to the speaker's corner where you can ask questions, you can grill them. No free legal advice from Rocky. He'll be charging by the minute as lawyers do, but I'm sure they'll be very friendly. Angie, thank you so much. Wonderful. Charles Mock, thank you so much for all you do for Hong Kong.